Hello everybody. Welcome to this webinar, which is part of World Parks Week. My name is Dominic Register. I'm a Program Director at Salzburg Global Seminar, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here. Salzburg Global Seminar is an independent, not-for-profit organization founded in 1947 in the aftermath of World War II and based in Salzburg in Austria. Our core mission is to challenge current and future leaders to shape a better world, which feels particularly topical and timely in the context of both the current crisis and for the discussions that we're going to be having over the next hour. The world is in the midst of an unprecedented crisis, a global pandemic of a different scale to anything almost any of us will have experienced before. And so many aspects of our normal lives have been disrupted or changed because of what is happening. This webinar is framed around the power and potential of asking what if. And this is obviously a conversation that could have happened outside of or before COVID-19. The fact that it's happening now changes the nature of the questions, and COVID-19 has unquestionably impacted on some of the thinking that the initial round of speakers have been able to do in terms of shaping the discussion. The world is different at the moment, and in amongst the grief and sadness and suffering that so many communities and individuals are experiencing, there are also some incredibly powerful positive stories about community cohesion, about compassion and kindness, about nature returning or appearing in places where it hadn't been seen before. So what we are going to try and do over the course of the next 55 minutes or so is have a positive conversation about the possibility of what if, and the conversation and the discussions that follow our questions will focus on solutions rather than the causes of the problems that we're talking about. To all of you who are joining, please feel free to join in the conversation, either in the chat function on Zoom, share where you're dialing in from, share your what if questions, or feel free to post questions to us as we talk about our ones. The format for the next hour is going to roughly be that the five of us will talk for about 25 minutes about some of our what if questions and try and answer any of the questions that are posed in the chat, and then we will open it up to a much wider discussion. So if you would like to speak in that part, then please use the raise hand function on Zoom and we can unmute you and bring you into the conversation. We'd also really like it if what we talk about over the next hour can go beyond the people who are joining through Zoom. So please feel free to tweet or share on other social media platforms about this. We're using 3 hashtags for this webinar. So there's the hashtag World Parks Week, hashtag Nature Never Closes, and hashtag What If. One of the programs that I work on in Salzburg is called Parks for the Planet, which is an annual meeting which focuses on the consequences of urbanization for human and planetary health. And I am really happy to be joined on this webinar by 4 amazing thinkers, activists, and leaders, all of whom have been part of Parks for the Planet programs in recent years and all as Salzburg Fellows. And I'm now going to ask each of them to briefly introduce themselves, and we'll then go into a discussion about our different what if questions. So Dan, if we could come to you first, and then Letty, and then Alison, and then Dima, and then we'll come back to Dan for his question.
Hi there, my name is Dan Raven-Ellison. I'm in London, in England, and the founder of the campaign to make London the world's first national park city. I'm a geography teacher by background, and enjoy sort of thinking about places and how we can make places better. This session is partially inspired by the question that was asked around the London National Park City, which launched last year, where essentially about 7-8 years ago now, we asked the question, what if we made London a national park city? And that big question then has been used to frame a lot of our thinking around big things, around policy in the city, but going right down to really granular things like what if people organise more picnics, or what if there were 1,000 more rope swings in the city? So using the power of what if at all those scales.
Great, thanks Dan. And Letty, can you introduce yourself please?
Yes, hi, my name is Leticia Lozano. I'm the co-founder and director of Masia Studio, an architecture studio advocating for play and child-friendly environments from a participatory methodology perspective. And my question is, what if the square meters of quality green space per person and the proximity to our homes becomes universal and mandatory? And if countries do not meet those expectations in the next 3 or 5 years, should they receive a fine?
Great, thank you, Letty, and we're going to look forward to getting into that question later on in the webinar. Alison, over to you.
Hi everyone, my name's Alison Barnes. I'm talking to you from a place called the New Forest in the United Kingdom. I'm a trustee of the National Park City Foundation, so I've been delighted to be working alongside Dan on the journey for London to become a national park city, and also alongside Dominic and others to create some visions around other national park cities in the world. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what everyone has to say today.
Great, thank you, Alison. And Dima.
Hello, everybody. My name is Dima Boulad. I'm dialing in today from the UAE, from Dubai. I've lived all my life in cities, and I purposefully sat here today on and like for you to see how much the buildings are taking over. So I wanted to be outside to show you this today, it's on my balcony. So just in the, I'm very happy to be here. So I'm essentially a human-centered designer, and I work along a team of design and innovation, which basically means that we use a human-centered approach to put users and citizens at the center of our processes so that we can build experiences that are co-designed and used properly. One of the big questions in my work and that I try always to think about is how we can humanize cities, and this is what led me to Salzburg seminar and meeting the wonderful people that are here today. And I'm not sure if I should go into my question now, Dominic, or are we?
Certainly share it now, and then we'll come back to it when we've worked through everybody else.
All right, so actually I want us to think today of the inside and the outside, and this is why I wanted to be outside today. And to reimagine in this era of COVID, how can we reimagine architecture and how it's introduced in an urban environment? And what if the interior and the exterior talk to each other more? And what if we imagine green spaces inside of our private spaces? So that's kind of my provocation today that I'm going to be talking about a bit more later.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dima. So we will come back to that momentarily. So what we're going to do now is spend about 4 or 5 minutes talking with Dan, and the 4 of us will talk to Dan about his what if question. If anyone wants to pose specific questions to anything Dan or any of the rest of us say, please put them in the chat function on Zoom, and I'll try and bring them to Dan's attention. Then we'll move on to Letty's question and work through the group, and then we'll open it up for a more expansive conversation. So Dan, what was your what if question? Oh, you're muted. What if you weren't muted?
What if I wasn't muted? You've got to hear me, and that'd be so much more powerful. Yeah, one of the things I've been reflecting on a bit, thinking about this, tragic circumstances that we're all in with so many of us in lockdown, some of the things that are happening as a result of it, both in terms of ideas that people are having about what might happen next, but also some of the practical things that are being established that could be transformative if they were leveraged in the right way. And it's on a very simple level, I think throughout the world, on streets, in buildings, in neighborhoods, there are WhatsApp groups, self-support groups forming and have formed that weren't there previously. So people have been able to communicate with each other and get self-organized around distribution of food, accessing healthcare, medicine, those kinds of things. But when the coronavirus emergency sort of falls back, my question is, what if we're able to leverage these WhatsApp groups to make our cities radically more green, healthy, and wild by mobilizing people and by sharing other what if questions and practices?
It's a great question, and kind of really consistent, I think, with some of the thinking that has been building around this Build Back Better movement. And what are we learning about how we're reacting to the current crisis that we want to make more visible and hold dear when societies start to return to whatever the new normal looks like? Dima, Alison, Letty, feel free to come into the conversation and ask Dan more about it. Oh, sorry, Alison, I thought you were unmuting and poised to move.
Actually, I wanted to sort of ask Dan, because I guess I'm one of the less sort of savvy social sort of people, social media that is, and just kind of I've always wondered how much we could really tell from kind of drawing together what people are doing on social and what's mattering to them, and whether we could do what you say, but also sort of use that to really notice what people are concerned about and what they're sort of really needing and wanting in their lives at the moment. And there must be so much kind of we could learn from that.
So the communities are becoming more closely knit because of how they're supporting each other.
Yeah, and how to capture that really, and how to sort of notice it as a collective. Just wondering if people got ideas about that, really.
One of the things I should have said in the introduction is that we were also interested in using this hour as a kind of example of collective, or the manifestation of collective intelligence. So if people know of solutions or research or innovative approaches to any of the things that we're talking about, then also please feel free to share them in the chat function, and we can collect them and share them afterwards through the World Parks Week site. I mean, are you seeing examples, Dan, in London where you're based, or with the National Park Cities movement, of kind of WhatsApp groups that started as social support initiatives beginning to take on another life?
Well, I'm taking inspiration largely just from what's happened in my street. You know, I live on a typical Victorian terrace house street of about 50 houses, all joined together. It's quite sort of densely populated where we are. And although people began talking about COVID, and there is conversations about accessing food and accessing medicines and that kind of thing, actually there's an awful lot going on as well around self-organizing, socially distanced music every Sunday. Kids getting together and to find out the names of the other children on the streets. They could draw a National Health Service beautiful rainbows, so that whenever any of us leave our doors, we've got these chalk rainbows welcoming us onto the street to go and explore those spaces. The fact that the cars aren't being used, and so people are playing out on the street in socially responsible ways more than maybe they were previously. So there are all these things happening that I kind of feel like should be happening on a street anyway all the time, that don't happen normally, that weirdly are happening more now we're in lockdown. So the question is, how could WhatsApp groups be used through communications, through campaigning, through inspiring people to then carry on those things beyond this crisis and to not forget these beautiful things that are happening at the moment. And I think particularly the question around how could you make a street 10 times better for play? How could you be like Friends of the Earth of us? How can you make a street 10 times greener? And I think that if people began to think about that consciously, really consciously throughout cities and these WhatsApp groups, then maybe more people would start asking those questions and making those things happen. So with the London National Park City, we ask this question, what if, a lot, and encourage people to ask what if a lot. But then the follow-up question is, well, why not? Why isn't this thing happening more? So if it's good to say we should have 1,000 more rope swings in the city, like, why not? Why isn't that happening? And if we know that the air in London is now clean enough that you can see the stars and you can see the blue properly of the sky, and you can smell now when there's pollution around because previously everything was polluted, then, well, why don't we have that more of the time? And so I think that if we could virally get more of these questions happening just in an organic level, on a street level, then we'd probably get more examples of what good practice looks like. And when people see examples of practice, they're more likely to then want to replicate that and share those stories in their own groups as well.
It's a great question just come in from Donna McFadden on the chat. So Dan asking if you can think of examples of legislative encouragement that could kickstart wilding of cities. When you were talking, and to give you a moment to think of a response, I was reminded that there was a study, I think, that came out last year about an experiment in Bristol where different streets had gone car-free over a protracted period of time, and it was the impact on community cohesion. And what they saw was that very, very rapidly, families from very different socioeconomic backgrounds, or families that didn't normally socialize together, started socializing much more because all the children were playing together on the street because it was safe. And I think the kind of sort of revolution that you're talking about speaks to some of that same research agenda.
And I think that it's something as well about the intimacy of a WhatsApp group that's Forest Street as well, that people know their neighbours and they're sharing pictures of each other's cats, and you're having that conversation at a very local level. And as soon as it opens out, I think that intimacy means you're less likely maybe to have such quality engagements. I mean, to answer this question, there's loads of stuff government could do, obviously, to properly finance and protect and support nature, right? And, you know, in terms of planning, there can be far more done in terms of making sure that new developments are always providing net gains for nature and wildlife in a far more exciting and compelling way than at the moment. But I guess one thing that I see in London particularly that would be another what if is, you know, what if there was almost like a Tinder for dead space, you know, where you can marry up an expert or a person who has the right levels of skills to look after that particular place, or the right energy, maybe they don't have the right skills yet, permission to use that space, and then maybe the resources, if resources are needed, to unlock that space in some way as well. And then equally, I think, like when my son was much younger, a problem that I had in London was that because it sounds like a really small thing, because school stopped parents meeting at the end of the day to collect their children, it stopped that interaction of parents meeting each other who are similar to each other. And as a result of that, we found it quite hard as parents to meet other parents who would also let their 7-year-old toddle down to the park and play on their own. And so it's very hard to strike up those opportunities for outdoor play. So equally, what if there was a Tinder specifically for issues around, for example, getting more children playing outdoors in parks? So I think there's an interesting thing about connectivity in the city, and what are the ways in which we can connect people to the resources, to the places at the right time, so that we can enable other kinds of social interactions, opportunities and pleasures.
Fantastic. Letty,
sorry, Dominic, to cut you in. But on a previous experience on another disaster, and I think I forgot to say I'm dialing from Mexico, so I usually am in Mexico City, and you know how in 2017 we had a massive earthquake, and the WhatsApp groups were the way people were both getting together, but also they were creating a full-on platform on where the resources were needed. And this then continued, like it was the immediate reaction, and it was those neighbor groups and those community groups that were the first responders. And with them, there were people getting ambulances, there were people getting even like trucks full of food and water, everything that was needed. And there was this gigantic way of like understanding each other and understanding every borough in the city, that what were the needs. So I think one of the learnings from that was that some of the groups were, of course, they vanished through time, but some of them didn't. And I'm part of one that, so we were helping out on our bikes, just kind of like carrying food and medicine around the city, because it was the only way that we could go around, us a little bit like now. So the biking group just kind of like relaunched when we started lockdown. And it's just because, you know, how bikes are being recommended, but also because we already knew each other, and because we already had that connection, if I may say, like a previous human connection of like, yes, we can achieve this together. It's not just me, it's like all of us that are in this group that are going to make an impact. Yeah, I don't think it has become a policy or anything, but it has become a normal kind of like a social rule, social way of understanding each other, that in case of a disaster, these WhatsApp groups become alive again.
It's a great point, Letty, because there's also, you know, this isn't the first time that there've been mushrooming them up of WhatsApp groups or other different ways of keeping communities more tightly together during times of crisis. And why is it that some of these approaches or some of these groups outlive the crisis and others don't? So there's definitely learning that we can look back to.
Just a small build-up, Dominic, on that. So I really like the example that Dan gave about the rainbows that are being drawn on the windows, because that's also an invitation to see like how we can use color in an urban environment to actually do this invitation as well. And I was looking at another initiative I think in London as well, where they were imagining the spaces around the essential shops, like just as the small supermarkets where people are just going right now, like they're using color to reimagine the space that's next to the shop, so that people can actually stand there but still be safe, but still have this connection and this intimate we're in this together kind of mindset. So it's interesting to just say, like, just to ask, like, what if we used color to reimagine public spaces, and just to reimagine this intimacy, this invitation to, yes, we are going to solve this together, we're in this together.
It's just reminded me, Dom, of somebody's put in about the social measures, and I think that's really important. You know, often as an ecologist by training, you know, we're very kind of we're always wanting to sort of get down to the biology, which is understandable, but I think what social media and these sorts of things are doing exactly what one of our participants is sort of saying, is that we need to measure the social capital and make that important. And it's like one person's choice each day by engaging with someone on WhatsApp and you know, nurturing a community together can change the course for that whole community. And I think the same, you know, if you're doing that across the world in different cities, I think you can actually start to make huge impact. And that goes alongside some of this kind of more sort of top-down legislative stuff we'd like to see. But I think it really does have great power and agency.
It's part of the same narrative, isn't it, around sort of changing the language from talking about social distancing to talking about physical distancing is actually much more than just semantics and labeling, because in many ways people are as much or more socially connected than they have been in the past. It's the physical distancing which is important. Let's move on to Letty's question, because we're 25 minutes in already and I'm doing a hopeless job of timekeeping. And also, when you talked about legislative top-down approaches, Alison, it did remind me of Letty's introductory remarks about how would we mandate this use of public space. So Letty, could you explain a bit more about your what if question and share it again with us? And you'll need to unmute, sorry.
Sorry, I was again. Yeah, I think also taking on the rainbow image that you put. Here in Mexico, we're not using the rainbows, but I think it's a beautiful way of also understanding how our cities are populated by a full range of people. It's not just, you know, it's not just adults. We have to take into consideration children, and I think many initiatives have come alive from understanding that this also impacts their daily lives, and this also impacts the way they understand their place in the world and how they are in here. And it was a big kind of a big question of, like, how do we explain it to them? How do we make them part of it? And I think that initiative of the rainbows is amazing, but it's also a reminder again of, like, okay, you go past a house that has a rainbow outside, and then you know that there's children there. And I think that is something that we forget, that we don't have the visual of how many children live around us. And I think that takes me to my question of, like, what if the square meters of quality green space per person and the proximity of this space becomes a universal thing, a mandatory thing? And what if countries, what happens to countries that do not meet these expectations of having a quality green open space where children and families can go out and play in a 10-minute walk from home? And this came from so I was talking to these guys and I was telling them how yesterday in Spain, children were allowed outside for 1 hour, but they were not allowed to go further than 1 kilometer around the houses. And I was just reflecting on, I'm in lockdown with my nephew, so I've been trying to just play a lot. But, like, taking him outside, it's quite a struggle, one, because of the lockdown, but if we were allowed to go outside for 1 hour in one, like a radius of 1 kilometer, we wouldn't have access to a park or a green quality space. So that is like a reflection of like, how do we understand our cities in different places in the world, and why don't we take this quality green space in proximity to the next level, and we make it a universal rule, you know, something that we all need to achieve in the next 3 or 5 years. Yeah, I think that's the context of it.
It's another great question, and it opens up all sorts of questions about equity and who has access to green space, just with your 1 kilometer example. I mean, Dima, you've got direct experience of activism around this topic. So maybe we could bring you in first and you could share something about the project that you did in Beirut a couple of years ago.
Yeah, so I've always lived in Beirut, and I came to the realization after so many years that I came to this number that not only shocked me because I was feeling it to my core, but also when I read that we have 0.8 square meters. So it was initially like a meter, but it was 0.8 square meters of green space per capita in Beirut. And I sort of imagined it. So I started by imagining what is the square meter, and how much it's insufficient in my city. This kind of realization like just shook me to my core, and I started realizing how deprived we are of public green spaces around the city. And so sort of like I think Letty and I when we met, we also really connected on that front, that we come from cities that are heavily deprived of public green spaces. So my what if that could build on Letty's example and share is, what if we imagine space in different ways? Because my contribution or my idea here would sort of question, if I took my neighborhood in Beirut, I don't know where we would have another park because it's overcrowded and it's overly I don't know where we can imagine another space. So what if we understood space differently? What if we looked at different kinds of spaces that could host these play areas or these public spaces or verticals or elevated areas? Like, what if we imagine different ways of having public green spaces?
So 2 interconnected questions. I mean, Letty, do you have a sense of what would the per person square meterage correctly be? And
how there's this this number of like 9.8 going around that apparently it's fake news, and there's no source, like real source of that number. So maybe someone at a meeting said like, oh, maybe 10 square meters, something like that. But I mean, it really depends. As Dima said, I think many of us are working in cities have heard of this slogan of like, by 2030, 80% of the population will be living in cities. But I think it's important to acknowledge that in the global south, and I will put Mexico in that frame. We've been living in the 80% of populated areas for many years now. And I think there's a lot of learnings from the way we've been doing our cities, but also there's a lot of learnings from how people are coping with this. So we could always do, play streets, we could always do green rooftops, even like vertical gardens or things like that. I mean, there's so many ways of doing it, but also there needs to be a push for legislation for it, because we cannot, in Mexico City, we cannot cope with providing 10 square meters of like quality green open space for 21 million people. Like, that'll be a gigantic challenge. So I think it's just a way of imagining how could we use what we already have, but in different ways? So say you have the example of the ciclovia in Bogota, you know, it's like in Mexico City, we have it every Sunday. So it's understanding our cities also in changing the way we use the space, so using it a bit more intelligent. So today is a road, but tomorrow it's an open area. It might not be extremely green and as green as we wanted, but we can work our way towards that. But we
like
need
in Jakarta, the cities used to get, a lot of the streets used to go car free.
The city, yeah.
I'd like to chip in and just sort of, you know, so London is, I mean, I don't know the numbers for other cities, but for London, more space is given over for roads than residential building footprints, right? About 5% of London is car parking. The majority of Londoners don't own cars at the same time, and the people who are most likely to die from air pollution or suffer the adverse effects of lack of mobility because of car traffic is also some of the poorest people within the city. So we actually have this massive expanse of space, and simultaneously we have technological advances, and maybe you could have policy or social advances that could free up an amount of this space as well. So a big what if question I would put is, what if half of all of our street space in cities became parkways, right? They became linear parks cutting through our cities. And, you know, you're talking about Mexico City. A thing that struck me about the urban form, spending a little bit of time in Mexico City, is quite often there's almost like these slithers of parkland that sometimes go in between two sides of like freeway, right? So if you can get onto that parkland, then that's great, but you're surrounded by cars either side. And almost as if that green space was put over to one side and the roads were both on the other side, that would be a pretty cool thing in its own right. But, you know, I just think that there is a future where within many of our lifetimes, private car ownership will go the same way as compact discs and DVDs. And the challenge to us is to make sure that this public space, which is currently privatized by cars, actually gets freed up for many people to enjoy for food, growing, play, and all these other activities. And if we don't keep our finger on that agenda, then actually it could be commandeered for example, privatization through companies that want to have space for their you know, automated traffic, right? So you accidentally slip into this space where actually you have just as many cars, just as little access. So that's another what if, and I think that what if question throughout our cities would help to solve Letty's what if as well.
We had 2 years ago in Salzburg, we had the Miguel Lopez, who's the mayor of a city in North Spain called Pontevedra, come and address the Parks for the Planet Forum. And Pontevedra is really interesting because they went car free more than a decade ago now in the city centre. And the knock-on effects of that one policy change, which started to reduce congestion, there's been all sorts of other really interesting social metrics. Or one of the questions earlier was around, you know, we need more qualitative measures as well as quantitative measures. And they were looking at things like, you know, the amount of time people spend eating outdoors now and in more social environments because it's safer and cleaner to do so. So there are some interesting case studies around there. Alison, can we bring you in and have your what if question?
Yeah, I was just reading some of the comments. It's all like pulling together. I mean, in my one, actually, it connects with what I think it's Gil's just said, a bit about, you know, none of this should be nice to have, it should be must have. And I think, you know, as we're sort of redesigning how we, you know, recover ourselves as well as recover nature, I think, you know, I love the idea of like redrawing, you know, almost drawing pictures really of what our streets might look like if they don't look like they do now. So I can really see, Letitia, even though I haven't been to Mexico City, I'm sort of imagining that we could draw that. Maybe your nephew could draw it, you know. Yeah. But my one was just kind of, I think somebody was saying, you know, how do we not forget all of this when we go back to normal and we'll start rushing around again? So yeah, what if we keep asking what if is one way of putting it, but more specifically, I was thinking, well, how do we kind of keep that within our day-to-day life? And I was thinking maybe what if we had, as part of our employment contracts, nature breaks, as well as lunch breaks and tea breaks and coffee breaks. because I guess, you know, even if at the moment our nature break is, I don't know, our window box, or, you know, wherever it is we can get to kind of have a nurturing experience and connection with some green, even watering our houseplants, if we're any good at that. Mine are not great. But, you know, I wondered whether, particularly in terms of connecting into the health side of it, whether we could recognize in our employment rights almost the need or the benefit of connecting with nature by having a nature break each day. So I'm thinking others will have ideas about how you kind of put it into our day-to-day life, some of the things that we're experiencing and benefiting from. You know, despite the fact that we're in hard times, there are things that we have benefited from, some of us. And, you know, not forgetting what that feels like, and keep asking what if, and sort of connecting back to our experience of what really matters to us in terms of our health and well-being.
I think there's all sorts of interesting productivity arguments that you might be able to make around that as well, in terms of getting employers buy-in if you needed to develop an economic argument, and thinking about, you know, the relationship between time spent in nature and the development of social and emotional learning competencies like empathy or creativity or responsiveness, which are kind of having much more economic analysis around their importance for the workforce of tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, on the economics as well, I think somebody's put here about public health agenda and that driving things. And again, I think we need to look at the economics of that now, like you're saying about, you know, productivity, empathy, EQI, or whatever it is, and be able to tell the story of that as we open up again, and make sure that it is part of that package around economics, as well as sort of social capital and natural capital.
Like a sort of Stern report approach where you look at the economic consequences of acting and not acting.
Possibly, you know, just to get it in front of people who need some of those hard data.
So there's a really interesting question from Scott Martin in the chat, which touches on things that all four of you have talked about. And so I'm just going to read it out verbatim. So all of this takes money. What new public investment mechanisms and strategies will emerge from this? Do you think we'll see more voter-driven ballot measures and investment interests? It would be great to get your thoughts on that.
I'd like to know Scott's visionary what-if question that leads us to a solution. I mean, the thing is, we need to ideate solutions and then test those things out, I think. So yeah, I'm going to challenge Scott back and ask what's his what-if? What would you like to see, Scott?
We could, if Scott's okay, we could unmute him at this point.
Oh, I'm always good being unmuted. That's
amazing. Welcome.
That's the easy part. I think Mitchell raised it earlier. The question is the public realm, and I love the way he framed that. Do we bring some sort of systemic regional approach? Do we use the 1970s word of metropolitan and think through more consistent funding strategies that address equity, address accessibility, but do so in a way, and this may be a little bit subversive, but go around the politicians who will always downvalue parks, whether they are liberal, labor, green, conservative, put us at the bottom and direct mechanisms that allow the voters to direct those funds as they see fit, which we know universally they would like to see in parks. Recognizing each one of those solutions is locally driven by our different governance structures. But I have to wonder if that will come out of this.
I mean, there is already there's this public policy that's been implemented in many countries and in many cities, that it's the I can't remember the name exactly now, but it's like this allowance, like this percentage of the council budget that needs to be voted, or at least here in Mexico, it's participatory budget. It started in Brazil and it's been implemented in many countries, as I said. Here it's a public vote, and we all, so the neighbors have to like create a project and they push the project forward, and then there's a public voting, but it's sometimes a little bit tricky, and I don't know if someone is in the audience from Mexico's government, but it's sometimes tricky because the council might push for like, oh, we need, say, rubbish collection trucks. And then they'll convince a neighbor to push that forward, and then convince other neighbors to vote for that. And then they are doubling the budget, if I'm explaining it correctly. So they do have budget for those rubbish collection trucks, but then they're convincing the neighbors to put their money into that. So then they have a bigger pot for it. So yeah, there is a public policy, it works. It doesn't work everywhere, and it depends on who's pushing it forward. For example, here again in Mexico country, in the north, there's one new platform that's been set up, and it's working kind of really good. So we'll see the results in a couple of years. So I think that there is an answer for that what if question that has had really good results, and it's been running for like, I think like 15 years already. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Letty, and Scott, thank you for the question. I'd like to go back to Dima, if that's okay, and the what if question that she posed in her introductory remarks, because it's a really interesting one, and again relates to lots of what we've been talking about, and we could spend some time on that, and then we'll open it up to the wider conversation. There's been some amazing what if questions coming in the chat. So Dima, could you remind us what your question was, and then Alison, Dan, and Letty jump in.
Sure. Actually, I'm going to rephrase this a little bit in light of the conversation that we had, and I'll just start with a small story quickly. While we were working on this initiative in Beirut to try to say, like, it was always, okay, we have very little public green spaces in the city, and we always focused on the negative. In our process, what we started doing is to look at the opportunity, like we switched the narrative a little bit and started like looking at the spaces that we had. So I'm seeing now in the chat about very different like ideas where you can connect different opportunities for spaces and different potential. So what are the opportunities in a city? How can we reimagine the spaces around the city that are not typical parks, let's call them, or typical gardens, typical green spaces, but how can you reimagine those spaces? And the way in our process, with the way that we worked, is we started looking at different spaces very differently. So again, to Dan's point, parking lots started making, like, we started seeing the opportunity and the possibility of what they could be. We started looking at the lots that are in between the buildings, like, okay, even if this is a very small building, what very small space, sorry, what could it be? So focusing on the opportunity and the possibility gave us a new approach to looking, new eyes. It just gave us new eyes to look at the city. And I would maybe like to reduce my my what if question in this sense, because I know to the previous conversation around public funds, I also come from a country that public, like, the funds are heavily misused, and I know that if we were to advance these new initiatives, we would have to do them in a very grassroots and kind of reclaiming these spaces. So what if we reclaimed those spaces? What if we reimagined how the interior and the exterior talk to each other, and reimagined what is a public green space? How can we reimagine it? I think I'll leave with this.
It opens up so many different avenues of thought, doesn't it? This idea, and like you said, it links back to what Dan was saying about reimagining streets and the way in which we use streets rather than just for cars. And I think it speaks to some of what Letty was saying as well.
And the idea that again, like the Tinder for abandoned spaces, or I don't know what it was then, but this is it. Like, this is brilliant. Like, what if we could innovate in that and really connect these spaces together? What if we can have like a map of the possibilities instead of focusing on how much we lack of these spaces?
Yeah, for me, like, a big question as well there is what if there were more invitations in the landscape that were social cues to tell you what the new normal should look like? So one of the things I really like about Play Street signs, which the people in the UK, like over 100 years ago, was that it didn't just say that watch out, when you're going down here on your horse or your car so you don't kill a child. What they're saying is this is a place which is not just for parking, this is a place where people play, and that's normal. And it communicates that. Equally, you know, we're all familiar with all these parks everywhere that say, you know, don't walk on the grass, don't play football, whatever. Well, I know this is a well-trodden point made, but we should actively think about how we can create more invitations to say, yes, please do this thing here. Yes, you are allowed to do this. Because so often people are so well behaved, they don't realize that they're not transgressing, you know? So we almost need to have a tinder of opportunities, but we also, as practitioners and professionals, sometimes need to let people know that some things are okay or even wanted. You know, help yourself to the food that we're growing in this park. Why don't you put on some music? Yes, please have a beer. I'd love you to have a beer and a barbecue in this park, because so many people think that those things aren't allowed, and the naysayers and knowers rule the thiefdom at the exclusion of others. Thiefdom, is that the right word? That's the wrong word. Ruth.
Tom, can I say something on that? I mean, I really think it's important to be positive and sort of look what can be done and show people very small, but then sort of it becomes sort of mushroomed, if you like, what the art of the possible is. And I think that going back to what Scott was saying, you know, about our leaders and our politicians, they're still humans as well. And if they can see it in their mind's eye and stand up and lead it and know that people are demanding it and understand what it is, I think we're much more likely to get things to move in the right direction. I mean, it's quite hard sometimes being the one who is the champion of this, and you feel like a lone voice in the sort of wilderness. But I think if we become cynical and we start to become cup half empty ourselves, we're really inviting everyone to sort of stay negative and stay doing what they always did. So it's kind of, how do we present in the way that Dan is kind of articulating, and Dima too, about, you know, this is possible, this is what it looks like, that kind of energy. And we all know the types of people we want to work with. They're the positive ones who make us feel like it's possible.
So, Mitchell Silver is on the call and made a really interesting comment earlier about the Parks Without Borders program in New York. And Mitchell, I wondered if we could bring you into the conversation. We'd love to hear more about that and how your experiences as Parks Commissioner in New York relate to some of the topics that we're all talking about.
Well, the main point, thank you for having me. The main point I wanted to emphasize is that we are now seeing the importance of parks that we've never seen before. We're a very dense city, 27,000 per square mile. And so we made a commitment to keep our parks open. When everything else is closed, they truly become a sanctuary of sanity. We're now taking a fresh look, and just so you all know, the mayor just announced this morning he'll be opening up 40 miles of streets for physical distancing, up to 100 miles next month. And so people are now seeing the value of parks and public space. The point I was making was this whole notion of the public realm. On average, most cities, it depends, it varies, parks represents about 15% of the city's footprint. Streets and sidewalks represents about another 40%. So well over half of the city is in the public realm, but far too often we have different agencies governing different parts of the system, and we need to, in the future, look at the entire public realm as a cohesive system, which is why I said it'd be good to have a conversation about a public realm authority. I know Mexico City has something very similar, don't know their jurisdiction. So we started something here in New York calling a public realm team, where Department of Transportation, Planning, and the Parks Department are conceiving about this Parks Without Borders, a seamless public realm where streets can be closed, merged into parks, rethink the function of a sidewalk. People are looking for a 6 foot, a 2 meter physical distance. Most sidewalks aren't even that wide. So it is going to require a very different way of thinking going forward. And we started those conversations in the past, but I think this pandemic has forced us to really think differently about the public realm in the future. So that's my big what if, and that's a conversation I'm looking forward to have because we hope this is going to be the last major pandemic, but if it is not, we need to be very better prepared. And now parks has been elevated really as a critical civic infrastructure and not a nice to have. is become vital to our survival going forward, because these are the places people are going to breathe fresh air, to build their immune system, parks clean, air quality, water quality, heat island effect. Now it is to saving grace in a pandemic. So that's my thought about just thinking not just parks, but the public realm in general, since more than half of almost every city is public realm.
My what if straight off the back of that would be, what if the extremes of the current pandemic helped politicians and voters and decision makers to realize all the things that are going wrong all of the time as part of our normal, that parks help with all of the time with, not in terms of the critical illness infrastructure that is hospitals, but think about the critical health and well-being infrastructure that parks provide. So actually just in terms of everyday problems in societies around mental health, around people's physical health, around the quality of air, so almost why has it taken a significant pandemic to affect the numbers of people we're talking about when very many more people are killing themselves, right? Or because they don't have access to the right kind of public and open spaces. So what if the conversation continued into what a normal looks like, where we always care for people, not just those who are susceptible to a pandemic?
Yeah, I think parks have now, it has always served that purpose. If you look at any pandemic around the world, parks have always served that purpose. And now is coming, our generation is now coming to that realization. And I absolutely agree with you, the public health benefits that parks offer. And my hope is that it now will be elevated and people now see the true value of parks. So I agree 100%. The public health professionals talk constantly about the value of parks. Now it's parks time and public space, not just parks, to really show that having a public realm which belongs to the public truly should be elevated. So I actually agree with you, Daniel.
There's a really similar and interesting debate going on within the education sector, I think, around how the pandemic and the shutdown of schools has revealed what people are calling the hidden curriculum, or all the additional value adds that schools offered around students' welfare and well-being that isn't measured or tested or recognized or didn't have visible value before the pandemic. And how, as schools begin to reopen at different speeds around the world, how do we continue to forefront that hidden curriculum and the things that have now been revealed?
I just wanted to say something. I don't know if colleagues from across the world know this, but the heritage of our National Health Service in the UK is basically comes from the same time, post Second World War, big crisis time, as national parks. So the national parks legislation in the UK was born out of the same political movement, which was all about health and well-being. So I guess I sort of flag it because it's been done before. I know it's a different time scale, but I think looking back in history, we can learn that people were thinking of these things when they were setting up our national parks. So, I think that's really interesting.
We've got about 5 minutes left. I'd like to change the focus slightly. There was a really great question in the chat earlier from Jenny Wood that touched on issues of intergenerational ideas about what good space looks like, and also a creative idea around community cohesion and how streets could work more closely together. So Jenny, if you could just share that idea and what led you to think about it.
Yeah, thanks Dominic. So I was just thinking a lot about how in working with children and young people, they're often really, really good at pointing out where the green space is and where the opportunities are. I think often in a way where a lot of adults have kind of blinded themselves to that because we don't look for new opportunities in the same way. But also from my experience of kind of rediscovering a lot of new areas of green space during this lockdown that I wouldn't otherwise think of. I think there could be a real opportunity for kind of community artwork, perhaps done by children and young people in collaboration with others, about what the opportunities are in the area and these different kinds of spaces that we often overlook for their potential, which could also kind of link in with what Dan was saying about kind of having a tinder of opportunities for this kind of thing.
Brilliant, thank you, Jenny. Letty, were you about to come in? I saw you on
I was just thinking that, hi Jenny, that Jenny's idea was brilliant. And yeah, I think all of the kind of connecting it to what Alison was saying about her what if question, and also what Mitchell was sharing with us, I think it all kind of relates into just thinking our cities from a more human-centered design approach, as in like what are we humans doing throughout our day, and how are we experiencing everything that's around us, and also timing like just thinking into what to with Dima's question is like, how do we start to understand also the public realm as the exterior of our own homes, and then we might be able to switch our mindset into what we do outside and inside, and what do we allow ourselves and not restrict ourselves to do outside as well, just in terms of being a little bit more playful and spontaneous, as Daniel was saying. It's just a reflection, really.
So we are almost at time. I'm going to close out in a second by going to the 4 speakers to ask them for their closing remarks. But just while they gather their thoughts, I wanted to share an idea that we'd had, that what we would love is if you could all share your what if questions on Thursday on Twitter, and encourage colleagues and people within your network to do the same. And we would try and create a sort of Twitter storm across the day with people sharing amazing questions about how we can rethink parks, cities, and nature. And if you use the 3 hashtags I mentioned at the beginning, so hashtag World Parks Week, hashtag Nature Never Closes, and the hashtag What If, we'll be able to collate them. And then there is a webinar on Thursday afternoon Eastern Time at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, which will close out this portion of World Parks Week. And my colleague Claire Shine is hosting that, and she'll be able to pick up some of the what if questions and discuss them with some of her panelists. But before I thank everyone, I'll go to the 4 of you for some closing remarks. Perhaps we could do it in reverse order to how we started. So Dima, we come to you first for a closing thought.
I do realize we're talking in a unique, like this webinar is happening at a unique moment in time, and as my colleagues on the call, the other speakers can also agree, like we have to take this opportunity to reflect on what has been and what is going to happen. We're not undermining the gravity of the situation, as Alison was saying offline. Sorry if I'm borrowing this, Alison. But we're not undermining this, but I think it's very important for us to recognize that things have been normal for a very long time, and we shouldn't accept it because it has been. What if we can take this opportunity again? What if we can take this opportunity to reflect on what is our ideal, what is our dream situation, and then really reflect how we can come together to make it happen.
Brilliant, thank you, Dima. Alison.
Yeah, so thanks, Dima. I mean, I think I think it's this keep asking what if at this time and going forward, because we do need to reflect on where we are and use the kind of what we're noticing about what we want and need, and to take that forward with us. So I think the reason I think it is important now, and as I say, we don't in any way, obviously the gravity of the situation is huge, but there will only be one chance to kind of do this kind of reflective piece. So it's really valuable to do it now before we all go off and start doing what we always did. I call it, I think Letitia got this, because I called it the human pinball machine. I don't know if you can sort of envisage that, where we're all sort of jumping around and doing, even ourselves, the ones that care about all of this passionately, we become distracted too. So I think my closing remark really is to keep asking what if and make time for that question. If you find yourself in a day where you haven't asked that question for at least half an hour, maybe you're rushing at things and not thinking them through enough, and so to get into that discipline is probably something I'd love to see come out of it.
Great, thank you, Alison. And Letty?
Yeah, I think, I mean, just kind of reflecting on what we've been sharing today, and I think something that hit me quite close to the heart that Alison said was that sometimes it feels like you're the one person just pushing for all of this, and I think it's always an amazing reminder that we're not alone, and that this crisis has showed us that there's so many ways to stay connected and to stay together and have an impact as a community. But also we need to understand our limits and take care of ourselves. So even if we're pushing for an agenda for everyone to pause and to keep themselves healthy, we also need to remind ourselves that we need to take a break and we need to keep ourselves healthy. We want to keep pushing for this type of work and agenda around the world and together.
Thank you, Letty. Dan.
A couple of things. I think, firstly, what if on Thursday, everyone on this webinar, which is currently 60 people, what if everyone got onto Twitter, even if you're not on Twitter at the moment, and shared 5 what if questions in 5 separate tweets and asked 1 or 2 other people, or 5 or 10 people, or your network to do that? Wouldn't that be really cool to have all those conversations around these sort of ideas of the future of urban life and cities and a better relationship with nature? I want to plug very quickly, there's a guy called Rob Hopkins, who is one of the key people behind the Transition Town movement. He interviewed us at the London National Park City about our what if question that led to London being made a national park city. And he's written a really cool book called From What If, from What Is to What If. And it's about the importance of imaginaries and imagining alternative futures and then making it happen. So if you want to dig further into the power of what if, then definitely look at that. And just as a pure guilty plug, I'd say, as you know, for Alice and I working on national park cities, what if there were 25 national park cities around the world by 2025? And could your city, where you are in the world, be a national park city? And what if questions might that generate for the public in your realm and city?
Fantastic. Thank you, Dan. And thank you very much to you and Letty and Dima and Alison and to World Urban Parks for inviting us to be part of this. This was the first webinar in World Parks Week. There are 4 more happening this week, and there are details on the World Urban Parks website. And thank you very much to all of you for joining the webinar, and please stay safe and well. Have good days.